Okay, all right.
I got you.
Very good. Very good. Well, I have an 18-year-old son, and whenever I do anything stupid or old, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop." So I am the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop, and that is I'm the first person to hold that position. I have been in that position for about 12 years, and although I may sound like I'm looking at retirement soon, I'm not looking at it any time in the near future, but we'll see. At a certain point in time, about 5 years from now, I stop getting paid for what I do. So we'll see. I call retirement when I stop getting paid for what I do. Good. So I plan to be working and working hard. When I started my job 12 years ago, I would tell people what I do, and they would say, "Good luck." And my kids told me that people would ask them what their dad did, and they would tell them, and they said that people would go, "Oh, oh, oh." And I said, "Well, what does the third O?" And they said, "Well, they just don't understand. They just don't understand." And I pressed it further, and it seems that the one thing that everybody knows about the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada, and especially the Church, is that the relationship is a troubled one, a difficult one. And so this is part of what people, I think, are indicating. And I have to say that when I first started, I didn't get crowds like this. This is a crowd for me. This is good. I'm happy. I would go to places and they would say, "Mark MacDonald is going to speak about the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people." And then I would go and it would be me and the person who was running the mic. And that would be it, you know. And I would say, "Where is everybody?" And the guy would go, you know, I think what he was trying to say is, well, you're the attraction. So, now, that changed. I noticed the change in Vancouver about 6 years ago, and you expected to get my usual hardly anybody there, and when I got there, it was standing room only. The place was filled with a couple of hundred people. Now, I don't think it was because of my reputation for being a sparkling speaker got around. I think that it represented a change, and that change has been fairly persistent since then. What I think has happened is that people have been injected with hope. Maybe not tons of hope, but enough hope that people have an idea that the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada is going somewhere in a positive direction. It's veering in a positive direction. And I think that that's true. What has happened is that the unique aspects of the Canadian relationship with First Nations, both the good and the bad, have become more clearly understood by people. And the highlight of the residential schools issue that we dealt with over the past 10 years tells mostly the story that's bad, but even in the midst of the bad story, the tales of the good story have begun to emerge. Now, part of our problem is that most of us learned our history through John Wayne, and not a big friend of Indigenous people, not known that way, but and the story in the United States was somewhat different than the story in Canada, in part because the development of Canada in terms of resources and industry was quite a bit different. So that, as Jonathan Ralston Saul points out in his book, A Fair Country, the relationship between indigenous people and non-indigenous people was one of respect, one of cooperation, and really one of interrelated need. So Canadians don't remember this very often, but Ralston Saul's point is that the Canadian economy was based on this cooperation between indigenous people and non-indigenous people. That the first few hundred years of Canadian industry and resource development was entirely dependent upon cooperation with First Nations people. It was entirely dependent upon First Nations technology. It was entirely dependent upon First Nations know-how. We don't begin to see a change really until the 1800s. And we don't see a profound change until the 1880s. And that's when the era of the residential schools begins. And you see indigenous people suffering from a whole bunch of things. Disease, because the non-indigenous population from Europe introduced all kinds of diseases that they were not geared for. They had medicine and a number of other things that were fine for what they experienced, but they were swamped by the introduction of new diseases that had a devastating impact on the population. It's estimated that millions and millions of people died. And more died of starvation and other things that were introduced because of other change that came along. But still, the relationship was one that was positive. Now, it was my great privilege and pleasure to get to know Chief Elijah Harper. He was very famous in Canadian history for the no that he said to constitutional reform. And this no, which really set Canada on a different path, was based on his intense commitment and feeling that to say that Canada was based on two founding cultures, one British and one French, that this was a lie, as he said it. And he said that Canada's history was based on three founding cultures, one that was Indigenous, one that was English, and one that was French. And so that's why he said no. He did not want to see the lie enshrined in the Constitution. Now, it was my great privilege to get to know him before he passed away a couple of years ago. He was a remarkable man. I got to hear him speak, and he would speak to anyone who would listen to him, and he would say, the elders, the Indigenous elders, had a very positive feeling about Canada's future. They believed that Canada was such a great land that you could welcome people from all over the world, that people could come here, and that together, the first people, and then the people who came from elsewhere, could come together and they could make a great nation, a place of great blessing and great prosperity for our children and our grandchildren. He said that was the elders' vision. And he was so happy when the apology from Stephen Harper came back in 2011. I was there at the meeting, and I was at a very fancy restaurant afterwards. One of the MPs brought a group of us out, and I was there at the dessert table, and Elijah Harper comes up to me and says, "You know, that stuff will make you fat." And I looked at him and I said, "Too late." And then he said, "We are free. We are free to become what God made us to be." This apology lifts the burden of all of that pain off our shoulders. Now, not all of the pain is gone, and there's still much to work on. But I think that the most important thing that I want to tell you is that there's hope. Now, I am more aware than most people of the things that still are plaguing First Nations peoples. In our communities, because of the poverty and because of the cultural dislocation, because of the intergenerational trauma, you have a death by violence and accident rate that was in the 1980s was estimated to be the highest of any ethnic group in the world. This is extraordinary. When I go visit a community, and there are over 200 communities that I visit in Canada, I always have to ask if it's okay to drink the water. Now, this should not be in a country with our kind of prosperity and our access to clean water. It just should not be. So there are all kinds of difficulties. The thing is that that's what most people, that's the only thing that people know. And so I want to balance that out by talking about the other side of it. The elders who give me such great encouragement. The young people who still have attitude. You know, in the face of that kind of poverty, that kind of difficulty, to still have an attitude, that's a wonderful thing. It took me a while to get used to the attitude. And it was an elder who said, "Isn't it great that our young people are still feisty?" And it is. It's a wonderful thing. So it is a future, however, that all of us have to invest ourselves in. We have to work at it. Now, people often say to me, what do I do? You know, I'm living in the metro area. Well, Toronto is is the second or third largest Indigenous community in North America. What is the largest Indigenous community in North America? LA. Los Angeles has more Indigenous people than any other city in North America. So we are in a place of Indigenous riches. Some of the most important Indigenous artists, thinkers, and teachers live in this city. So it's possible to access these things on a regular basis. In addition to that, there are people that have powwows, Indigenous dance gatherings, that are specifically designed to invite people who are not Indigenous so that they might have a taste, a flavor, and a participation in Indigenous culture. The original vision of the powwows, which came to a Lakota woman back in the 1800s, was that Indigenous people would dance, display their culture, and it would be very attractive to non-Indigenous people, and that is the case. I've never met anyone who went to a powwow and said, "Well," people always enjoy it, and they happen all over. All you have to do is Google "powwow in Toronto," and you will see when the next one happens. And if you wish to make a relationship with Indigenous people, that's something that can happen, something that is available to you. So, I think that we are in a unique moment, and we are making a transition from the old to the new, from the good to the bad. Now, there's a similar kind of moment in American history. It happened a little over 50 years ago when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his speech, "I Have a Dream." Now, up until that point, Martin Luther King had made a case that was broadly accepted in the United States, that a great harm and injustice had been done to African American people. Virtually everyone agreed that that was the case. But very few people thought that there was any hope for change in the near future. And it's well documented that President Kennedy, who was the president at the time, that he thought we were decades away from seeing any substantial progress on the relationship between African American people and the rest of the United States. But what happened there is a remarkable shift. What happened is that Martin Luther King not only made the case to help people to understand the oppression that his people had experienced, he also made a different case, and that was every single American has a stake in a better future. That every single person would be blessed by this thing. And he helped to introduce to enough Americans that it made for some of the most sweeping changes in American legislation. I believe that we are in a similar time and a similar point. I think that our Martin Luther King was probably Elijah Harper, and I'm sad that he's not here to keep speaking to us. But what Martin Luther King did, Elijah Harper did. Martin Luther King said that God had planted the seeds of a better future in the past. A remarkable thing to claim. To say that the founding, and they were pretty much mostly men, but the founding fathers of American democracy had planted the seeds of a better future was a remarkable thing. These are people, many of whom owned slaves, and who didn't view people like Martin Luther King as being fully human. But the ideas of justice and equality, these things were things that they planted and that sprouted. In the same way, Canada's past have the seeds of a better future. The vision of the elders and the ideals of those who started this country are something that points us in a better direction. And so I hope that we will believe in hope, and I hope that we will all commit ourselves to that better future. There are all kinds of ways that I've seen that happen, and some of them I think I've mentioned in what I've said prior to this. Now, the Anglican Church, which tends to see itself as a little bit of Britain in the Canadian context, is I think a uniquely Canadian church, because we have one of the largest populations of indigenous people who are part of who we are. We have 225 churches, about 65,000. About 5% of Anglicans are indigenous. And when you get to the north, pretty much everybody is Anglican. We have a very strong presence in the Arctic North. And we are one of the most northern churches in the world. That should be a part of our identity, part of who we understand ourselves to be. And there, in many of our churches in the north, the churches are growing. Well, thanks to a robust birth rate, I think. And this is something that nobody expected to see. In the beginning, and to this day, to a certain extent, people saw indigenous people as being primitive. What we used to be like was how they were viewed. There was no understanding that there was wisdom, there was a depth to the culture that was important. Today, it's become a commonplace for leaders to talk about the way that indigenous wisdom points the way forward for us on environmental issues. The Pope has written a book called Laudato Si, an encyclical they call it, which frequently mentions the importance of indigenous wisdom to our collective future on this planet. This is completely unprecedented. In fact, most people thought that indigenous people would die out or they would fade into the body politic. The vision after the initial phase of Canada's life was that indigenous people would disappear. That was the plan. And even in the church was committed to that plan. We now know that that was not only misguided, it was dumb. Today, indigenous people are the fastest growing demographic in Canadian society. And if you go to places like Saskatoon, which I go to on a regular basis, usually to get some other place remote, more remote in Saskatchewan, you begin to understand that the school system in Saskatoon is over 50% indigenous, mostly Cree from around that area. So we are a group of people that have, as a part of our life, a strong indigenous presence. Now, there are 30 dioceses in the Anglican Church of Canada. Do you know how many indigenous bishops there are? You know? Yes. How many? One. No. This is astonishing. There are 9 indigenous bishops in the Anglican Church of Canada, and this has all happened over the past 10 years. There are now more indigenous bishops by percentage than there are indigenous people in the church. This is something we never expected. And there's going to be an election of 3 bishops in the Arctic Diocese of the Arctic in March. And I expect that at least 2 of those 3 will be Inuit. If that's the case, we'll have 11 and perhaps even 12 indigenous bishops. That's a remarkable thing. And we are fast becoming one of the most prominently indigenous organizations in Canadian public life. This is something to be proud of. I know some people are scared of it, but that's okay. We're going to show them that it's a good thing, and it will be a good thing. So my own background is mixed. You might tell from the way I look that I am not all indigenous by any means, but I'm part indigenous. I like to think of myself as kind of a microcosm of the Canadian church. Part of me is indigenous and part of me isn't. But I have to say, I like both parts. I enjoy both parts. And I think that as we grow as a people, as a church, that we will as well.